おまけに
So knowing this, right? Morita was already in Ichinose's pocket. It hasn't. So a loose end or a detail that I'm curious is it. They didn't disclose when Morita is in uh Ichinose's pocket. So the whole play for Ayabe, which is what this is concerning with, may have been entirely orchestrated in the first place. So to the point where Kuroiwa already knows that Ayabe had leaked information to Yagami, and you could make an argument that Yagami was placed on a loose leash until he became a problem. And Kuroiwa is largely being controlled by Hamura, or Hamura is the closest contact, but Ichinose has a leash on Hamura, and Ichinose is connected with Morita. So Morita's play by arresting Ayabe was probably with the full knowledge that Hamura and Kuroiwa framed Ayabe the whole time. And so during that scene where it looked like he was pulling a fast one or being clever by using Yagami as a bait to set up Ayabe's arrest, might have been entirely conspired up to make Yagami chase around things. So Yagami might have been on a loose leash legitimately the entire time. And if we think of it in that way, the one thing that Yagami was successfully able to circumvent and pull a fast one on Ichinose, Kuroiwa, and the gang is that his charisma for being forgiving and merciful and truthful, right? The seeking of truth and his link with the emotional bonds like Matsugane and maybe even Mafuyu, Kaito, Higashi. So all his emotional bonds that created the noise in emotional decision making were the goats in how Yagami being on a short leash ended up surprising Ichinose and all the peeps. But Ichinose and all his gang more or less had what they believe everything under control. Even the little ripples that Yagami creates were under control. It was through Yagami's pursuit of truth and the tragedies and the largely just tragedies that came about through his actions trying to help everyone and save everyone that ultimately led to a lot of emotional noise making that created big waves. And ultimately, the silver bullets came down from that. Hamura's eventual testimony, which spiraled into Kito's eventual testimony, those were the silver bullets that were the results of Yagami being on a loose leash. One may even say this is one of those things where you make an argument like why leave Yagami on a loose leash when you have all the power, the influence, and the people behind you? Why don't you just remove the problem, right? Like nip it at the bud, right? Generally speaking, a lot of times when it comes to like fictional writing, you make that people who probably think about it more of a less interconnected thing, more of a straight arrow thing. They would say, well, if it's the villain being complacent again, where the villain has all the knowledge, but they let the hero get stronger and build up enough in order to fight them? Why not they just take out the hero when the hero was still weak? Well, the idea about these games, and I really appreciate that they continue to do these things, is they place as much detail as possible to demonstrate, to ground the world that even people with incredible influence have to play ball with the systems in place, because they made it believable in a sense that it might have been more convenient to place Kaito, Yagami, Ayabe, and stuff on a loose leash. And this was a theme that shows up all the time in Like a Dragon game, in games made by Like a Dragon Studio, so RGG Studio, is the idea that if you place someone on a loose leash or maybe a tighter leash, you can control and manipulate the problem. When you remove a problem, it can be replaced by another problem of which you don't have control over. And that theme perpetuates a lot, especially with the idea between organized crime, politics, and law enforcement. And this would be the same case. Like a lot of times when you have a fictional writing, it would take place in like a fictional, like a fantasy setting, right? And the fantasy setting would have a very straight, linear form of interaction. If a villain can be easily viewed as, oh, if this villain is all powerful, why not remove all the sources of opposition right from the start? And that's a fair argument a lot of times. And generally speaking, games like these don't really, they're still not really mainstream. I'm going to be super blunt about this. I mean, at most, it's still like 40, 30%, 30%, 40% audience, I would say. Getting there. But the idea is writing these things is incredibly hard. And it takes when I mean by incredibly hard, I mean, uh, it's hard because it's uncommon, in my opinion. And the threshold to make it sufficient is above the standards that are required. So you could liberate a lot of resources and time and game time and whatnot by not tackling these type of world building, character driven narratives. In this case, that also means that most people who play games, the stories are incredibly linear. And what I mean by linear is linear in psychology, linear in thought. And it's kind of ironic I use the word linear because generally in the gaming space, when people talk about linear stories, they talk about not having choice in the stories versus having choice. A game that has choice with multi-web conclusions is considered non-linear, and that's fair. I'm not using it as a mechanical thing. I'm using it as a writing, linear as in a writing thing. As in, this story progresses linearly, but its resolution and its development, whenever the player is playing it, is not linear. So the nice thing about this being a detective story is not the idea that the detective mechanics of storytelling is linear, is the storytelling is non-linear. As in, it could have gone in any direction. Like Morita, even through his tragedies, could be a character that completely is repulsed by 89's crimes, right? Like the crimes that made 89 possible. Like he could have been one that uphold the law over his emotional baggage with dementia. So the characters are incredibly unpredictable, like not necessarily unpredictable in the sense that you didn't see it coming. you can see lots of potential ways a human can interact. And that's what makes the storytelling so compelling, in my opinion. It is a non-linear story. It is linear mechanically, as in you as the player go for the ride. That's fair. I just feel like it's such a disservice to not highlight how difficult, or yeah, I'm going to use that word, how difficult it is to write a story that includes enough world building that makes characters behave in a way that can be very engrossing. Where what are they going to do next? Like, you could reasonably see this character doing 3 or 4 different things in their situation, and they would all fit the character's personality, right? It's not, I'm Superman, and well, Superman's only going to do what Superman does, and it's probably one thing. Sometimes, if you get surprised, it might be 2 things, but it's generally just one thing. And that kind of makes me miss games like these. I mean, this is technically the ninth game, and still does not get old about the storytelling. Anyways, just a little side note about Morita. Like, I didn't know where this was going, because I really felt he had a chance of seeing reason through being exposed to Yagami, but it didn't go that way.
警察の内部情報も裏社会に流していた。おそらく新谷弁護士はそういった秘密を知ってしまったんでしょうね。だから綾部はその
I like these little things where they constantly like do the non-verbal stuff with the camera, because it's a very detective thing. I would say this is far more this virtual camera work is very, very reminiscent of old school or long established camera work for detective mystery, like uh like form of storytelling, where it constantly reminds you of the symbolic stuff, like lots of repeated motifs, and one of them is the badges, and that's the badge for the prosecutor. They did it when Mafu was talking, and then whenever like Hoshino occasionally would show that they're, an attorney, what type of attorney. It gives you extra information that reminds you visually what they're doing, while contrasting it with what they're saying.
口を塞ぐために撃ってしまった。突発的に警察の銃で。
なるほど。検察はそういうストーリーで行きたいわけですね。
My little, just to give one last remark, my little digression is because, generally speaking, you can really pick out the people who are used to linear thought when it comes to storytelling, because those are the critics. Those are the ones that would say, this is unbelievable. Like, why can't they do this? Why can't they do that? Like, they should have done this and that. And those are fair, like, logical standpoints from a very limited perspective. Something that from someone who normalizes how simple storytelling is. So it's not to say that they aren't incapable of thinking about it in like a world building standpoint, but generally speaking, that's also required to understand the perspective of these people, right? The people RGG is writing these games for, a vast majority of them, that's why I mentioned like 30 to 40%, the vast majority of them are more used to both linear, isolated, secluded story plots with exclusive world rules that simplify story plots. It allows the stories to be linear in logic as well as linear in mechanics, so that it is easy to follow and everything makes sense. And that whole phrase of somehow emotional portrayal of emotional characters, emotional human beings somehow needs to always make sense, which is not generally what is compelling about world building stories. World building stories have loose ends, they have luck factors, they have happenstance. Things don't always work out, and it's always not clear a lot of time. Like 30, I would say the vast majority of the time, it's not clear where they're going to go. Coincidence happen. It feels like luck happens. Like, oh, what a coinky dink, this happened. But then this breaks open. However, did they take advantage of it? No, they didn't. That kind of thing. All the characters have it has to be weaved complex enough that most of the things that happen in the story seem plausible, but not logical. As in, not this is the only way they can go about it to conclude the story. And what happens when you have a narrative and a world building thing like that is everyone has their opinions about what was the most reasonable way to go about it. And that's when RGG, in my opinion, succeeds. When a story writer succeeds is when there's controversy with the storytelling. If there isn't any controversy with the storytelling, that isn't just some blatant, I don't know, what a twist kind of thing, like for, like a linear story that was meant to blindside you or like jump scaring or things like that, that was a mechanical thing. When you have dissonance and arguments about how the story should or could or may resolve, and all of them have evidence to back up why that would be the most reasonable, a story writer would take that as a compliment, in my opinion, because they have weaved a complex enough world around characters that live in a world with so much systems and unanswered questions that the people who play and read and see the game has so many unanswered questions and answer questions at the same time. That's when you succeeded in storytelling, in my opinion. Some of the greatest novels in history and whatnot, that's what makes them timeless. They're constantly viewed from a different perspective. Multiple perspectives are applicable to the story. When you don't have controversy with the story, generally speaking, then it's probably a linear story. A story that makes absolute sense, it's one-dimensional, and it can only be seen by the vast majority of people to resolve in a singular way. And that's also successful in its streamline. Like if a writer wanted it to be straightforward, they are focusing on something else as well as making the story straightforward. But these stories are not. And the reason why I'm saying this is because I'm trying to I was prepping my thoughts the last week about how I'm going to review Judgment's story or how they took it, right? And it also means I had to become familiar with all the critics and all the responses and whatnot. And yeah, it's, I think it's such a disservice because it's not common to have a story that has multiple interpretations and multiple where and when. So I'm always talking to myself when I'm watching the story over and over again, because each time I think of it slightly different and it means all the difference. Otherwise, you would skip all the story again. So what is that? That represents over 50% of gamers, in my opinion, at the moment, because the vast majority of industry standards is to create a story that once you see it once, it all flows really well, and they all contextually reinforce each other. This leads to this action, which leads to this action, which leads to this, and it's done. To me, even if this is only told in one resolving way, I forgot the order of action, what the meaning of those actions are, and that's why I brought up kind of like the Morita thing. Like, it changes the perspective if you think about it differently, which is great. It means complex storytelling. What is inherently a little bit disappointing, in my opinion, is that because linear storytelling is the normalized standard, because I respect that developers have to cut or prioritize specific things because of their vision and all the diminished return that they get from the current modern standard about story is secondary to the retention and cost and reviews even. And it's the last point that's kind of disappointing to me, where it's become so normalized to have linear stories that when a story produces friction and dynamics and complexity, which is like a game like this, it creates arguments, like disagreements, and that hurts the game's rating. Like, it's become a stigma as opposed to a celebration. Because when I see all those like 7s and 8s and lost points because people didn't agree with how the story went and they had their own opinion and then they used the game's story, it's ironic because those people complain about the story sucking, but they remember so much about the story compared to all the games they give 9s and 10s because the story is forgettable. As in, it's not forgettable in the sense that they don't remember the details. It's forgettable because it's like the vast majority of stories they're used to. The good guys win, the bad guys lose. That's the end. The good guys win, maybe there was a sacrifice in it. The bad guys got what they deserve. But they were like winning at first and then they eventually lose. That kind of thing. So the general idea is persistent, and that becomes normalized as acceptable for a 9 out of 10 to a 10 out of 10 game. That's very deflating to me. And it also illustrates why, I mean, one of the major drivers that developers stray away from complex storytelling, that RGG studios have to take risks every single time when they present a new story, a new origin story, which I'll get into when we talk about reviewing Judgment. And like Casca, Yakuza Like a Dragon, we've already completed that. It was a controversial take because the first comment people make is Casca, like just a little bit of digression towards Casca, like when they talk about Yagami, right, and Judgment, it's around the time they announced that Casca will be taking the lead in the main line, and these are two very different origin stories, right? It's the two lines that will be moving forward and leaving Kiryu Saga behind, sort of, tentatively. And so many comments would be like, wow, Casca acts like a child. He's so unrealistic as a person. It's like, you have no idea what a real, like, in my opinion, it would be argued that you have no idea what a normal 30-year-old millennial person who went to prison and then get normalized to a social media battered world would behave like. However, these people would say like, oh yeah, I don't want my character, like my character, to behave like a 6-year-old kid who yells at everything and become very optimistic and make mistakes and stuff. I want my protagonist to be like Yagami, a superhero who always seeks truth and somehow survives all the things he is convicted of, but he was caught in a web of intrigue and conspiracy the whole time, orchestrated by a higher political power. Yagami here is poetically trying his best, but if you think about the perspective of Ichinose and everyone who's involved, he's actually just a dog on a loose leash. Like, there are higher powers in order, and it might reflect those people's wanting to be a person who's like, yeah, we can fight the system kind of thing. It's like, that's fair. It's just that it's not that simple. And what Yagami does is how I felt about like the Kiryu saga. People immediately are repulsed by Casca's lack of power, lack of influence, like lack of conviction, versus someone like Yagami and Kiryu who has full conviction, always gets away with their vengeance, like justice and truth seeking. But in reality, it's kind of ironic because those people who say that's more realistic, that's my jam, they're normalizing what video game does a lot, which is to create protagonists that ultimately do not suffer the consequences of their actions, like in a really, really complex way. And if you look at it, that's kind of one of the things that make Yagami and Kiryu very lucky characters. Casca was easily one of the most unlucky characters. And I'm going to be real here. He is far more realistic when it comes to the genre he depicts, which is not the same thing as Yagami, right? A little bit later, I'll probably mention how I feel about Yagami's character. It is Kiryu if he was a detective, and I can understand why people bundle Yagami and Kiryu together as a argument against Casca, like, because Casca represents a lot of the insecurities and all the things that are bounded by reality. Like, he is a character that is damaged, not filled with all the answers, do not have a resolve that's unbreakable, very soft-hearted. Those are the qualities that are stigmatized, in my opinion, by the people who like these types of games, I suppose. Like a substantial, significant number of people who like these type of game. It's kind of interesting and coincidental that Casca also plays like a JRPG with party members and a turn-based system, because a lot of the soft-hearted characters and stories that revolve around requiring supporting characters that create a party system, because the most realistic type of existing characters in the real world, I would argue, are people who have support systems. Yagami sorta has a support system as well, but it's nowhere near the realistic support system of Casca, which is often represented by JRPGs, really coincidentally or not so coincidentally. There's a deep dive in there that I would like to share in the future. However, in these games, yeah, Yagami would most definitely be buried in a grave somewhere. It's so early on. So it's kind of nice that they're kind of keeping a balance. It's kind of like Kiryu surviving like 2 decades worth of incredible feats. So I'm gonna go back and finish the finale. We'll continue. This is more like a preview of my closing thoughts about Judgment.
まあ込み入った話は奥でしましょうか。
あんたのこと調べましたよ。 森田検事正。10年前、ご家族に不幸があったようですね。
誰かが告げ口でもしたかな。
ついこの間まで、ずっとあんたを信じてた誰かがね。小野のラボで、あんたの対応は異常だったよ。法の番人たる検察官が、法よりもアドデック9を第一としてた。ここに来てだんまりはやめましょうよ。
私の母は若年性のアルツハイマーだった。進行が早くてね。発病してから母はあっという間に私の顔も名前も忘れてしまった。私を見るたびに「はじめまして」と言ってね。そして時には泥棒だの人殺しだの罵声を浴びせることもあった。症状が悪化していく母は見ているだけでつらかった。だが兄はその母を長い間ずっと介護し続けた。たった一人で。兄も私も若い頃から法律家を志してた。兄は毎日がむしゃらに勉強していた。私よりもずっと努力してたよ。でも結果は司法試験に受かることはなかった。なので私が一発で受かった時はさすがに心苦しかったな。でも兄は自分のことのように喜んでくれた。兄はいつも優しかった。
続けてください。
母の病が発覚した時も兄は母の体を心から心配していた。でも私の頭の中は葛藤でいっぱいだった。母の介護をすべきだという気持ちと法律家としてのキャリアを終わらせたくないという葛藤でね。そんな私を察して兄は私にこう言った。母のことは心配するな。お前は偉くなって自分が果たせなかった夢を叶えてほしい。それで自分は十分だ。とね。そして兄は24時間、7年もの間、自分を息子とさえわからない母のために介護を続けていた。私はその役目から逃げ続けた。いずれ何か破綻が起きると心のどこかで気づいていたはずなのにだ。
あんたはその後悔からアドデック9のために一肌脱いだ。いつからだ？
新谷弁護士が殺害された後、私は一ノ瀬事務次官から直々に腹を割って話がしたいと呼ばれた。
一ノ瀬が直接？なぜ？
一ノ瀬さんはいずれ我々検察がアドデック9の闇にたどり着くと予測した。そしていろいろ調べるうち、私にアルツハイマーに家族を奪われた過去があったと知った。それで一ノ瀬さんは私を話せばわかる人間と判断した。彼の提案は明快だった。アドデック9は病に苦しむ患者とその家族、多くの人々を救う新薬だが、それを世に出すためほんの少し目をつぶってほしいことがあると。
なあ、あんたこんな言葉知ってるか？
ん？
火は鉄を試し、誘惑は正しき人を試す。 もし何かの犠牲と引き換えに不老不死の薬ができるなんて言われたら、あんたは多分何万人死んでも目つぶってんだろうな。
私にも罪悪感はある。だからここまで君らに付き合った。
生野は人体実験を隠蔽するために寺沢恵美を殺した。あの子が一体何をした？その罪を着せられて大久保新平は死刑を待ってる。いつ殺されるかわからない日を3年も送ってきた。でも彼が何をした？あんたの罪悪感は口だけだよ。自分が何してるか分かってんのか？
黙れ。
あんたの兄さんが果たしたかった夢ってのはそんなことだったのか？え？検事正！
もう黙れ！黙れ！
俺を黙らしたきゃまた殺すしかないな。俺は大久保君と綾部の弁護人なんだ。恵美ちゃんの無念を晴らすためにも黙るわけにはいかねえんだよ。タボ、黒。
That was that scene is so powerful. I might even argue it ends up being this gets reiterated when in the later event where Yagami confronts Shono and his motive, right? It's very similar. But the idea is these are two incredibly large philosophies. The idea of right and wrong, and like the path of purity versus utilitarian, right? Sacrifice for the greater good kind of thing. And this is an inevitable theme that will occur. It's ubiquitous. And if you're gonna do anything that deals with politics, even religion, law and order, ethics, morality, you're gonna have to tackle the human condition when it comes to the value of a bigger vision versus the micro path of one's legacy to that, like to establishing like the ends justifies the means versus the process kind of thing, dealing with morality, beliefs, and conviction. So this one is a really big one, right? And it comes up again. It'll come up again later in the finale where you hear Shono's desperation. And it already came up because this happens a lot in terms of a lot of times dealing with scientific advancements, right? The sacrifices being made. And it's always a really incredible, touchy subject in many ways than just two. Like, it's not just Morita's perspective versus Yagami's perspective, but it's one that is incredibly ambivalent. And it's a topic that does come up quite a bit in video games. However, in my opinion, more often than not, the writers would like to remove the ambivalence by stacking it one way or the other. So here, you're gonna be very familiar with Yagami's plight because you're playing, you're in that role, you're in his role. However, RGG does try quite a bit to balance the scale, as in Morita's story, right, his background story, and then you have it stacked onto Shono, You have it stacked on to anyone who's ever experienced a loved one who has dementia. So all of that kind of evens the scale. It doesn't create the whole thing where just he's evil, right? This character is. Now here's the thing though. The thing that really tips the scale towards Yagami quite a bit, just to make it not as a safe bet, is to have a protagonist, as in the person you're playing, not the fact that the person is good or not. I think sometimes we forget that the protagonist, it is the person you're playing, not the person who's inherently good or desirable. We've challenged this notion quite a lot, but it has been normalized often. Protagonist, as in the person who's positive and desirable and stuff, but not necessarily. And in this case, Yagami comes off as someone who has a point, but it's countered by just as big of a point. It would be great to see the other side of things, but in general, when it comes to video games at the moment, having anti-heroes, quote unquote anti-heroes, or those who have not a very desperate, noble intent, tends to be off-putting for gamers in general, I would say, because gamers like to not feel like they are forced to in the shoes of a character that is something that they don't want to be. That's kind of a normalized thing nowadays, where the character has to be someone you can openly root for, and that kind of detracts from this too. It works against RGG when they have to constantly paint everything in the grays, because the more complex a story becomes, the more complex the motivations become. So as Yagami ages into the series, I imagine it will become grayer and grayer as it goes, just like Kiryu Saga and Casca's saga. So I'm looking forward to seeing where they take it. So far, the stuff that I experienced in Lost Judgment, it continues this thing where they add a person who kind of shifts the scale towards Yagami. And the reason why I'm saying that is that person that tipped the scales to make the casual, I would say, the casual people who have normalized linear villain story, villain hero storylines just walked in. Kuroiwa is the guy who truly is the closest thing to sociopath. And when it comes to detective stories, a lot of times they kind of tip the scales to the side where it's on the side of the protagonist. It's very reminiscent of a lot of detective stories. The elephant in the room would be Sherlock, right? Moriarty is the psychopath or the sociopath per se. And over the years, iterations of Moriarty has become a little bit more less villain, like closer more than a human being, right? Instead of just playing the villain. This is relevant because Lost Judgment then takes on those things with arguably the second core part of its story development, which is the school stories, and it reflects around themes of Sherlock Holmes. And Sherlock Holmes, in the most recent iteration, like the most popular iteration, shows the dangers of being from one lens. And Sherlock themselves have become humanized, as in he very well shares a lot of commonalities with Moriarty. So Kuroiwa is the guy that tips the scales because none of the characters are as selfish and potentially only self-interested as Kuroiwa. So this character is center stage to throw the scales over to the character that you most resonate with, the character that you spend the most time with, which is Yagami. And just as only a slight spoiler, I guess, this this type of scale throwing, just to make sure like you're on the right side, guys. You as the gamer are on the right side. They throw the scales again in Lost Judgment. While Judgment, the reason why I'm thinking about scales is because that's what Judgment is. It's a teetering scale, right? Are they right? Are they wrong? Are they guilty? Are they not guilty? However, in Lost Judgment, the pattern continues. There's another person who basically just tips the scale one way or the other. And I think that's a safe bet. I kind of understand why, or understand some of the intent and the motivation of putting Kuroiwa, a character like that. And that's something that is worth highlighting here at this point, because we're truly going to see Kuroiwa at his core. And he is a character none other like any other characters in RGG's legacy. RGG has not have a legacy character that is a one-off character that is quite unapologetically a villain. And in my opinion, it's a clever way to make it more obvious how one should feel about having Yagami's back. But to me, I see Kuroiwa as something that rarely happens, and that Yagami's actions only make me want to see another spin-off series or something, or like a companion series where it involves a character on the other side of the table or on a different table entirely, because Yagami still is the Kiryuism, and he is more or less a spiritual successor to Kiryu in a different context. We'll go into that a little bit more, but he is the hero complex. He is the guy that arguably most males would probably be okay with being. For me, it's both. Like a human being, I mean, I make an argument, you know a lot about specific sides of Yagami, and you only know specific sides about Marita. So the gamer, the person who's playing, only knows specific sides of each character because of the events that has happened. You do not ever see Morita fighting crime over his many, many years. Even understanding the 89 conspiracy, you do not see any of that. You do see Yagami in a sense. And in this game, you do not see Yagami when he's making mistakes. He's hurting people's feelings. He's self-interested. You can kind of see glimmers of that, like the idea that he has things that he don't do very well, like Mafuyu, right? Relationship with Mafuyu. He kind of neglects his friends a lot. He's a guy who's very lucky to have friends that concerns themselves with him than him concerning with his friends. You might make an argument it's like, no, but Yagami looks out for it. I wouldn't say in a equating way. Kiryu, on the other hand, you could see where that goes into the other extreme. But just saying, just to produce, you only see what's available in front, and you have to imagine the rest. Like all the things that Yagami does well is what you see in the game, because you're playing the events that highlight those skills. You don't see all the things that you probably aren't very good at, technically. Like, if he's always constantly seeking truth, he can't possibly appreciate and relate to anyone who doesn't seek truth. So what I mean is, he can't, right, in this very case, he is unsympathetic and okay, he might be slightly sympathetic, but he can't possibly empathize with Marita's struggle. Even though he reads the files and all that stuff, he can be somewhat sympathetic, but the way he said it and stuff is reflective of his character. He can't possibly understand how someone who spent his entire life through all that, become a lawyer, witness all those tragedies, he can only do the best he can. And he's still seeking the truth, right? That's the idea. And somehow the truth gets more weight because you are behind his character. You are not behind Morita's character. You are not behind Shono or even Kuroiwa. In fact, here's a little slight hot take, I guess. Slightly hot take. Most characters that are in, I would say, let's just say, the last 5 years of gaming, some of the top protagonists in games, they're most of them are Kuroiwas. Pretty much all of them are Kuroiwas. That's what makes this particular intersect between Yagami, Morita, and Kuroiwa. Morita is collateral. Yagami is your protagonist. Kuroiwa is your antagonist. But generally speaking, Yagami is not as popular, arguably, as a lot of others, because he is a protagonist that has baggage and like have to make tough decisions and whatnot. And Morita is collateral, so they're all your NPCs that either get killed or get caught in the crossfire of your protagonist. And then Kuroiwa is the antagonist because they only share with you just enough that you know that he's just sadistic in nature. But if we were to frame this and take it and put it into other games, Kuroiwa is the character you're playing most of the time. That's the irony here. That's what games like these really poetically highlight. The most popular type of archetype, character archetype right now, in my opinion, is Kuroiwa. A character that does what they want, tear down anyone who gets in their way, and make themselves feel the best because they can do everything and they're unstoppable. That's FromSoft's games. I'm just saying. Like, if you're gonna break it down to the fundamentals, you are a character that is unstoppable. You have no remorse, no recalling, no investment in any of the people you take down. They are inherently evil to your eyes. If you want to get into the mindset of Kuroiwa and how he could commit these crimes and he could fully embrace and try to make 89 a reality so he becomes immortalized, which he'll express in the finale right before he gets apprehended. Kuroiwa's vision is the blank slate character you play in most action, quote unquote, action RPG games. You don't actually play a role, in my opinion, unless your role is Kuroiwa, because that's the only role cookie cutter blank slate characters can be. And I would go even as far as saying that's who Link is in Legends of Zelda. You do everything in your favor. All the things you have, you're not probably even convinced that you're invested or can even summarize what Zelda's motivations are or Ganon's motivations are. You are Link. You are the character that always plays in your own interest. You have all the tools. You're given all the tools to be creative, sadistic, masochistic, if you will, because you some of FromSoft's things and challenges that are self-imposed, like no hit runs and stuff. That's masochistic in nature, but it's selfish in nature. It's for clout. It's for self-interest. So when you are forced into a role-playing game, in my opinion, where there are actually roles to be played, you generally feel confused, ambivalent. Should I feel good about this? Why do I feel good about this when it makes me feel guilty? So you're in the role of Yagami, like, or the role of even Morita if you can, or Shono if you can, because it questions how you feel about someone else's role, like the mindset. And that's like one of the biggest deep cuts I have with introducing a character like Kuroiwa into the series. Generally speaking, characters like this stick out like a sore thumb in complex storytelling and world building when you have a character that's simply completely rotten to the core. Like, what I mean by rotten is from the perspective of your protagonist, rotten to the core. Because these are the type of characters that are the most common in video games that do not have complex storytelling. These are the one-dimensional characters that make the storytelling in other games very straightforward so that you can focus on the other stuff, right? The being a superhero. How do you create a superhero that can do anything? You make a Kuroiwa personality. Imagine having a superhero that has to be like Yagami. That superhero would not go around kicking everyone's butt and thinking it's right. What kind of game would that be like? That's a little weird, right? Like, oh, I'm doing the right thing, so therefore that's all there is. Well, Yagami actually gets pretty close to that. In fact, Kiryu is the one. Actually, I'm gonna give the crown to Casca. Casca is the one where doing the right thing gets you hurt still, and doing the second best thing could be a better thing than the first best thing. Like that's the idea. Like, when the most classical gaming character archetype is a one-dimensional character that is self-serving. It's Kuroiwa. And it's, to me, I think it's kind of a breath of fresh air, but at the same time, take me out of it a lot, where a character like that, like Kuroiwa, to climb to the police force, right? Head of Kamurocho PD, somehow charm Hamura, get in bed with Ichinose, like all of that. It's the nightmare scenario. But it's poetic because when people play video games, they abandon being Yagami and Morita and Kaito and become a Kuroiwa. That's what video games make you feel. You play a character like Kuroiwa. Just bring it all back. And then now we get to see all that happen. The next couple scenes, that's my thought process. Like, that's the counter to everything else. Like, yeah, Kuroiwa murdered lots of people and stuff, but you still hear his thoughts. And even when he was down on the ground talking to Shono soon, it's hard for me not to see all the other types of protagonists in other game series. They don't make you think. They don't make you second guess your motivations. You are always right in those games. You might even think, I'm doing a wrong thing by shooting things, but it's so right in a video game. It's like, that's... If you want to get into mindset, Kuroiwa is the most common character archetype, in my opinion. Even more common than Saori, who's like a tsundere for any Japanese anime fans. Kuroiwa is the most common archetype. He is self-serving. He does anything in his own vision to create legacy for himself. He is there to do everything that benefits himself, be it getting the achievement for the most kills, or, you know, just a deep cut at myself because I am playing this game as a completionist. It's just, that's what great storytelling does when you have characters to frame it around. If all your characters out to kill in a video game, then Kuroya won't stick out. You won't really relate to Kuroya. Well, but ironically, it's, in my opinion, when you're in a video game, most people relate to him the most, whether they know it or not, in my opinion. I'll let him go about his business now.
もう